November 28, 2004, Nairn, Scotland. An unidentified man arrives at the front door of 30-year-old Alistair Wilson and hands him an empty envelope with the name Paul written on it. The man shoots Alistair 3 times and takes the envelope back before fleeing the scene, and the murder weapon is found in a drain 10 days later. Investigators explore a number of different theories and eventually conclude that the crime might be connected to a dispute over a decking area at a hotel pub across the street from Alistair's home. But while there is at least one potential suspect, no one is charged with the murder. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and for the first time in a while, our podcast will be traveling across the Atlantic to Scotland to cover one of their most baffling cold cases, the 2004 murder of Alistair Wilson. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Alison Simmonds, the latest winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Alison. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for nearly 8 years now, so if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions near the end of this episode. Anyway, the murder of Alistair Wilson is probably one of my most highly requested cases which I have yet to cover, as it's definitely a major head-scratcher. I'm always terrified by stories in which someone is murdered and it appears that a professional hit took place, but nothing can be found in the victim's background to indicate what the motive could have been. Alistair Wilson was a seemingly ordinary banking manager who lived in the town of Nairn, Scotland with his wife and 2 children before a mysterious man suddenly showed up at his front door one night and asked for him. For unknown reasons, the man gave Alistair a seemingly empty envelope with the name Paul written on it before he shot Alistair to death and took the envelope back before fleeing the scene. For years, investigators have explored a number of different theories, including the possibility that Alistair's murder was a case of mistaken identity or connected to his job in banking, but in recent years, it's been revealed that the crime might have been connected to Alistair making a complaint about a new decking area for the pub at a hotel located directly across the street from his home. In fact, police now believe that 2 people might have been involved in the crime, and while they think they know the identity of at least one of the perpetrators, they lack the evidence to make an arrest. We have just passed the 20-year anniversary of Alistair's murder, and this case has been in the news a lot lately because of the Wilson family's very public frustrations with the police and how they have handled the investigation, so I thought now would be a good time to produce an episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Alistair Wilson. Our story begins in 2004 in Nairn, Scotland, a seaside fishing port town located in the Highland Council area which had a population of around 11,000 at that time. Nairn is a popular holiday resort town, as the iconic comedian Charlie Chaplin was known for frequently taking vacations there, and Academy Award-winning actress Tilda Swinton currently lives on a property in the area with her family. Our central figure is 30-year-old Alistair Wilson, who has spent the past 2 years living in a 3-story Victorian house on Crescent Road with his 33-year-old wife, Veronica Wilson. Alistair hails from Ayrshire and originally met Veronica while working at a Bank of Scotland branch in her hometown of Fort William. In fact, the couple got engaged within 6 weeks of meeting each other and have now been married for 6 years, and they also have 2 sons, 4-year-old Andrew and 2-year-old Graham. Alistair is considered to be an upstanding and highly respected member of the community, and he works as the business manager of a Bank of Scotland branch in the nearby city of Inverness, where his responsibilities mainly include dealing with loan applications from small and medium-sized companies. However, Alistair has recently given 2 weeks' notice at this branch, as he is planning to start a new job as commercial director of the newly formed environmental consultancy office, Building Research Establishment Highlands. On Sunday, November the 28th, Alistair spent an ordinary day with his family, and at around 7 p.m. that evening, he had finished bathing his 2 boys and was getting ready to read them a bedtime story when he heard the doorbell ring. On this particular night, the Wilsons were looking after the 18-month-old son of a friend of theirs, so Alistair initially assumed that the child's parents were arriving to pick him up. But when Veronica answered the door, a stocky, white, clean-shaven male whom she did not recognize was on her doorstep. She would describe him as being between 35 to 40 years old, between 5'4" and 5'8", and he was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, a dark blue waist-length blouse and jacket, and dark jeans. Veronica would later say that she felt the man had aggressive body language, and without making any further conversation, he simply uttered the words, quote, "Alistair Wilson." Veronica went upstairs to fetch her husband and told him that a quote-unquote weird guy was there to see him. Alistair did not appear to be expecting anyone, but he headed downstairs to speak with the man on the doorstep while Veronica continued preparing their sons for bed. According to Veronica, Alistair and the man had a conversation, but it was too muffled for her to hear anything. A few minutes later, Veronica heard her husband close the front door before he returned upstairs, and he was carrying a bright blue A4-sized envelope. Veronica said the envelope was open and appeared to be empty, and while this detail was not shared publicly until 2017, the name Paul was inscribed on the outside. Alistair appeared to be confused about the whole situation, but Veronica confirmed that the man had asked for him by name. Alistair then decided to head back downstairs to see if the man was still there, and Veronica said she heard the sound of the front door opening, followed by another conversation she could not make out. Well, it wasn't long before Veronica heard what she described as 3 loud bangs, and when she headed downstairs, she soon discovered Alistair lying in the doorway in a pool of blood. He had been shot twice in the head and once in the chest. When Veronica stepped outside, she caught a glimpse of a man walking quickly down Crescent Road to her left. She immediately called emergency services for help and then ran across the road to a pub at the Havelock House Hotel to tell everyone there that her husband had been shot. Some of the customers from the pub ran over to Alistair's residence to help him and used some towels to try and stop the flow of blood. By the time paramedics arrived, Alistair was still alive, but even though he was rushed to Regmore Hospital in Inverness, he was pronounced dead about an hour after he arrived. The police launched a massive manhunt for the shooter and set up several roadblocks in the area, but they were unable to find him. Veronica and her 2 children were moved back to a safe house for their own protection, though they would eventually move back into their house in Nairn and are still there to this very day. Police soon revealed that Veronica, her own family, and Alistair's family were investigated for potential involvement in the murder, but nothing was found to implicate any of them, and they were not considered to be suspects. Even though Veronica claimed that Alistair had shown her an envelope which had supposedly been given to him by the shooter, it could not be found at the scene, and the perpetrator presumably took it with him when he left. The crime left the community in complete shock, as Nairn was not known for violent crime, and there had not been a murder there in 18 years. When investigators delved into Alistair's background, they could not find anything, such as a secret affair or involvement in illegal activity, that shed any light on why someone would want to kill him. At one point, Detective Chief Inspector Peter McPhee told the press, quote, The question of possible infidelities was something we had to look at, but there was nothing. We have not found a dark side to him. If there was, we would have expected to find it by now." End quote. Alistair's recent decision to resign from his job at the Bank of Scotland was due to the fact that he was unhappy with his promotion prospects and had a disappointing experience where he thought he secured a multi-million-pound loan for a house-building company in Orkney, only for it to be turned down by the head office. However, there was nothing to suggest that Alistair had uncovered or gotten involved in anything shady at his job, and investigators did not believe that his decision to leave had any connection to his death. While there was speculation that Alistair had been the victim of a professional hit, the police weren't so sure, as they could not understand why the killer did not immediately shoot Alistair when he arrived at the front door, rather than conversing with him, handing him an envelope, and allowing him to go back inside the house for a few minutes. Since the man specifically asked for Alistair by name when Veronica answered the door, this seemed to rule out the possibility of mistaken identity, though police did speak with at least 19 other people who shared the name Alistair Wilson. In fact, another person by that name lived in Nairn, just a few minutes away from Alistair's residence, but he was in his 60s at the time and died in 2017, and there was nothing in this man's background to suggest he would have been a target for murder. 10 days after the crime took place, some council workers were performing gully cleaning on a blocked drain on Seabank Road, not far from Alistair's residence, when they uncovered a small antique pistol. When it was turned over to police, forensic analysis identified it as the murder weapon used to shoot Alistair, though tests performed on the gun failed to extract any DNA or fingerprints. The pistol turned out to be a rare, semi-automatic 25 caliber Haenel-Sewell Model 1 Schmeisser patent handgun, which was manufactured in Germany sometime between 1922 and 1945. In addition, the 25 caliber ammunition used in the shooting was manufactured in the Czech Republic by the company Cellier & Belot sometime between 1983 and 1993, but since the gun and the ammunition had never been registered, investigators were unable to track down whom they belonged to. During the early stages of the investigation, it was also reported that a cigarette butt had been retrieved near the crime scene on Crescent Road, and the police managed to obtain an unidentified DNA profile from it. But since I've never heard any follow-up on this, I'm not sure if it was ever established that the cigarette belonged to the killer. In November of 2005, shortly before the one-year anniversary of the crime, police took the unusual step of publicly releasing a video of Alistair's then 4-year-old son Andrew being informed about his father's death by a child psychologist who told the boy that his dad was not coming back. In addition, they also released the audio of Veronica's hysterical, panic-stricken phone call to emergency services after she discovered that her husband had been shot. Police got Veronica's permission before releasing this material, as they hoped it might stir someone's conscience and compel them to come forward if they had information. Unfortunately, the investigation remained at a standstill for the next decade, but in 2016, the family of an elderly man who was being placed in a care home had been cleaning out his house in Nairn when they uncovered a small pistol in the attic. It turned out to be a 25 caliber Haenel-Sewell Model 1 Schmeisser patent handgun, the exact same type of weapon used to shoot Alistair. The elderly man had originally acquired the gun when he was a prisoner of war in Poland during World War II and brought it back home to Scotland with him as a souvenir. There was nothing to indicate this man had any connection to Alistair's murder, but given how rare this particular handgun was, investigators found it to be an interesting coincidence that 2 separate antique pistols of the exact same make would turn up in a small town like Nairn. In November of 2016, John Beattie, a popular BBC Radio Scotland personality, was providing some 12-year anniversary coverage of Alistair's case on his show when a caller left a message with one of his producers claiming to have known what happened. The caller's real name has never been released publicly, but Beattie has always referred to him as Peter and said that when he got in touch with him, Peter seemed genuinely fearful of his own life. Peter claimed that a friend of his had been doing work for a businessman from the Scottish Highlands who had once been involved with a loyalist paramilitary group in Northern Ireland. When Peter's friend questioned the businessman about the work they were doing, the businessman threatened him and his family and apparently shared information to indicate he might have been involved in killing Alistair Wilson. Records showed that Alistair's Bank of Scotland branch did banking for at least one of the businessman's companies and police did take a statement from him, but they ultimately found no evidence to tie him to Alistair's murder. In November of 2017, David Wilson, an emeritus professor of criminology at Birmingham City University, told the press that he had recently received a package from a sender identified only as Nate. The package was also sent to the newspapers The Daily Mail and The Scotsman and was subsequently turned over to the police. Nate claimed that there was another independent witness to the crime besides Veronica Wilson, and his theory was that Alistair had gotten himself into financial difficulties and received a substantial loan from some shady figures in exchange for performing off-the-books banking services for them, such as money laundering. However, since Alistair decided to leave his job at the Bank of Scotland, his lenders became unhappy and arranged to have him killed. Nate also revealed that the name Paul had been inscribed on the envelope which was given to Alistair prior to his murder. David Wilson stated, quote, "I'd always previously assumed that this was a master hitman who carried out this particular crime and the case would be unsolvable. Because of what the package contains, if it is accurate, I now think it is eminently solvable." End quote. Well, police have frequently stated that they found nothing in Alistair's background to indicate he had financial difficulties and have not uncovered any evidence to support Nate's allegations. Like I mentioned earlier, the detail about Paul being inscribed on the envelope had been withheld from the public during the earliest years of the investigation, but after David Wilson mentioned it to the press, Police Scotland finally confirmed that the detail was true. In November of 2018, Peter Blexey, a former homicide detective with the Metropolitan Police, released a book about this case titled To Catch a Killer, My Hunt for the Truth About the Doorstep Murder. While working on the book, Blexley summarized the killer's potential motive by stating, quote, "He went to the front door to negotiate, not assassinate. He was prepared to kill, but didn't intend to kill. Something during those exchanges altered the dynamic, and Alistair died as a result." End quote. In October of 2020, Alistair's son Andrew, who was now 20 years old, did his first public interview with the Guardian newspaper, in which he revealed that the only memory he had of his father was finding him after he'd been shot. Andrew sent out a public plea for information about the murder, stating, quote, "For the last 16 years, I have been left wondering why I didn't have a dad like all my friends. I still cannot believe how someone could shoot my dad dead on our doorstep while my brother and I were upstairs. The only memory of my dad I'm left with is the image of him lying on the doorstep. Photographs are all I have, and no family should suffer the way we have all these years." End quote. In March of 2022, Police Scotland stated that after performing a fresh review of eyewitness statements, they were now releasing an updated description of the man from the doorstep. Even though he was initially described as being between 35 to 40 years old, investigators now felt he could have actually been as young as 20 years old. Weeks after sharing this updated description, police made another announcement that a witness had recently come forward and informed them that about a month before the murder, they had seen two men with a handgun on East Beach in Nairn, which is located a short walk away from the Wilson residence. One of them, who was described as being in his 20s, was reportedly pointing the handgun towards the North Sea, and the second man appeared to be between 40 to 60 years old. 1 month after sharing this new information, Police Scotland made yet another big announcement about the case, which shed some light on a possible motive behind Alistair's murder. They revealed that the crime may have been connected to a planning dispute over a large outdoor decking area which had been installed in the car park of the pub at the Havelock House Hotel, which was located directly across the road from the Wilson residence. During the spring of 2004, a man named Andy Burnett took over as the new landlord of the hotel. Burnett later relocated to the province of Nova Scotia in Canada, so investigators had recently taken a trip there in order to re-interview him. When the outdoor decking area was constructed at the hotel pub, Burnett did not get the required planning consent beforehand and instead submitted a retrospective planning application on November the 8th of that year. However, Alistair and Veronica were not happy with the new decking area, which was in very close proximity to their home, so much so that outdoor patrons could see through their windows from the deck. As a result, the Wilsons frequently kept their curtains closed in order to maintain their privacy, and they were often annoyed by the loud noise of the pub's patrons, particularly when they became drunk and rowdy and would toss their beer glasses off the deck into the street and the Wilsons' garden. Alistair decided to lodge a written objection with the Highland Council's planning department, and the Havelock received their own copy of it on Friday, November the 26th, 2004, 2 days before Alistair's murder took place. In fact, it's been reported that over the course of the weekend, regular patrons of the pub openly expressed their unhappiness about Alistair's complaint and the possibility of losing the decking area. Police Scotland now suspected that this dispute may have been the motive behind Alistair's murder, as Detective Inspector Gary Winter stated, quote, "So you may have a relatively minor matter that results in conflict and the potential for a level of violence that is totally disproportionate to what happens. These things do happen, fallouts over objections to car parking, planning permission that results in conflict," end quote. Investigators confirmed that they did not consider Andy Burnett, the former hotel landlord, to be a suspect. On the night of the murder, Burnett had been drinking at another bar down the street, but showed up at the Wilson residence after Veronica yelled for help. In fact, when the paramedics started carrying Alistair's stretcher, he accidentally fell off, so Burnett stepped in to help the paramedics put him back on there. When police first made their announcement, they said they were trying to identify anyone who was involved in the construction of the decking area back in 2004, as well as people who visited the Havelock on the weekend of the murder. Well, in July of 2023, Police Scotland announced that they now believe 2 people were involved in the murder, as one of them may have lured Alistair to the front door, while the other one carried out the shooting. In fact, they had identified one potential suspect, and even though his name has never been released publicly, they did reveal that he was a Nairn resident who would have been in his early 20s in 2004. This man was known for being a regular patron at the Havelock pub and allegedly kept guns inside a locked cupboard during that time period. At the time this announcement was made, the suspect was serving time in prison for supplying drugs, though he was apparently released sometime in 2024. Since this guy was a local resident, he may have feared he would be recognized if he showed up at Alistair's front door, which is why he enlisted a second person to do so in his place. Investigators also stated that the drain where they found the murder weapon was positioned in a spot that suggested that the gun might have been tossed in there from the passenger side of a vehicle, another detail which once again pointed to the involvement of multiple people in the crime. Well, in December, 5 months after this announcement was made, the Wilson family sent an application to the Police Investigations and Review Commissioner in order to complain about the handling of the investigation into Alistair's case. As a result, Police Scotland and the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service met with the family to discuss the situation. Earlier that year, the Wilsons claimed that Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Livingstone had told them that the arrest of a possible suspect was imminent and was scheduled to take place on May the 15th, 2023. But nothing ever happened, as the suspect was never even detained for questioning, and the Wilsons claimed that Livingstone flat out lied to them by saying he was unaware that a specific date had been identified for this arrest. In September of 2024, it was announced that Scotland's top law officer, Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain, had ordered a complete reinvestigation into the murder, so new teams of prosecutors from the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Service, and new officers from Police Scotland would be taking over a new cold case review. Veronica and Andrew Wilson then told the press that they had lost confidence that Police Scotland would ever solve the case, labeling them as quote-unquote incompetent and stating that the relationship had greatly deteriorated over the past 18 months. In November, Livingstone was found guilty of misconduct for lying to the Wilsons, and while he was replaced as Detective Chief Superintendent, he was never suspended or fired. Around the same time period, Peter Blexley publicly revealed that he had recently received new information that shortly after Alistair's murder took place, an eyewitness had come across a tearful elderly man sitting on a bench. When the witness asked the man what was wrong, he supposedly replied, quote, "I cannot believe that I have raised a son who would do such a thing," end quote. Even though it was possible that this elderly man had already passed away, Blexley still wanted him to come forward if he was alive, and for the unidentified witness to do the same thing and share everything they remembered about this encounter. In early January of 2025, while I was working on this episode, it was announced that John Swinney, the First Minister of Scotland, had met up with the Wilson family to offer his sympathies for Alistair's murder, and he agreed to look into issues about the case which had been brought to his attention. Veronica was particularly perturbed by the fact that Police Scotland's Chief Constable, Joe Farrell, has refused to meet with her and her family to discuss the case, stating, quote, "We find that deeply insulting and hope that she will urgently reconsider. We will not stop demanding answers, and it was pleasing to have the opportunity to raise them with the First Minister," end quote. Even though a number of new developments have been brought to light these past few years, they have still not led to an arrest, so after 2 decades, the murder of Alistair Wilson continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I've already said numerous times that I'm always perturbed by cases in which someone is murdered in what appears to be a professional hit, but there is nothing in the victim's background to shed any light on what the motive was. Some other examples of this which I've covered on The Trail Went Cold include the 1994 murder of Matt Flores, the 1992 murder of Doug Johnston, the 2008 murder of Kanika Powell, and the 1991 murder of Vera Anderson, another case from the United Kingdom which I explored last year. In some of these murders, mistaken identity has been pushed forward as a theory, but that doesn't appear to be the case here, since Alistair Wilson's killer showed up at his front door and specifically asked for him by name. I guess I can't discount the possibility that he was looking for a completely different Alistair Wilson, since I'm sure that isn't a particularly uncommon name in Scotland, and there was even another Alistair Wilson living in Nairn at that time. But with the information we first had, I used to think that there was no theory which made 100% complete sense. I first became familiar with this story several years ago, and I've also listened to a long-form, multi-episode podcast about it titled The Doorstep Murder, which was produced by the BBC and hosted by journalist Fiona Walker. It was released in 2018, but this was before all the information about the Havelock pub decking area came to light, so the Doorstep Murder had to produce a new update episode discussing this angle in 2022. Likewise, I already mentioned that former homicide detective Peter Blexley published a book about this case in 2018 titled To Catch a Killer, My Hunt for the Truth Behind the Doorstep Murder, and while Blexley did make mention of the decking dispute between Alistair and the Havelock, he did not seem to place much significance on it at that time. In November of 2022, the BBC released a new 45-minute documentary about the case titled The Doorstep Murder, Who Killed Alistair Wilson, and it concluded by presenting this all-new theory. Unfortunately, it seems like in the 2 years since this information came out, the relationship between Alistair's family and Police Scotland has deteriorated in a huge way, and it appears that the Wilsons have reached the end of the rope and are no longer hesitating to publicly direct criticism towards the investigation and seem to be particularly frustrated by the alleged lying and lack of communication from the police. Even though investigators seem to have their own ideas about what happened here, including the identity of a potential suspect, the Wilsons seem quite skeptical that an arrest will ever be made or that Alistair's case will ever be solved. This is why I really hope police know what they're doing and aren't barking up the wrong tree with this whole decking area angle. For many years, I was left completely perplexed by this case, but if this new theory is correct, then I almost feel like banging my head against the wall over the idea that this well-liked and well-respected husband and father may have been shot because he filed a noise complaint. And what's even more senseless is that the alleged perpetrator may not have even been someone who had a financial stake in this whole situation, but rather a guy who just decided to commit murder over the possibility that he would no longer be allowed to hang out on this decking area of his favorite pub. This just goes to show that you can spend all this time brainstorming a bunch of wild conspiracy theories about a seemingly complex murder plot, only to find out that the real motive was incredibly stupid. It bears repeating that this theory seems so absurd that I really hope investigators are on the right track, because I'm still left with a ton of unanswered questions. I mean, It would be one thing if the perpetrator got drunk at the pub that night and decided to cross the street to kill Alistair in a fit of rage, but this crime was carried out in a very calculated fashion and may have involved more than one person. We'll get back to this angle in a little while, but if this decking area theory is accurate, then I still have no idea why the perpetrator or perpetrators would hand Alistair an empty envelope with the name Paul written on it and then allow him to go back inside his house for a few minutes before they shot him. As much as I hate to do this, I suppose now would be a good time to explore the possibility that Alistair's wife Veronica could have been complicit in his murder. I certainly do not believe she was involved, but since this envelope was never found, I do have to acknowledge that we technically only have Veronica's word that it ever existed in the first place, and there are no other independent eyewitnesses who reported seeing this mysterious man at the front door. However, police have never considered Veronica to be a suspect, and since the audio of her hysterical call to emergency services after finding Alistair's body has been released publicly, you can tell that she was left genuinely traumatized by the whole ordeal. Since Alistair never made a will, Veronica had to submit a formal application to be appointed executor of his estate. It was about a year before she inherited anything, so it's not like she made an immediate financial profit from his death. Veronica has also never stopped spreading awareness about this case or advocating to have it solved, and like I just mentioned, she has recently been very outspoken about her unhappiness with the police investigation. Let's put it this way, since police have stated numerous times that Veronica is not a suspect, it would make no sense for her to become their enemy and publicly label them as incompetent if she was actually the killer. In recent years, her son Andrew has started giving interviews and talking about how traumatic it's been to lose his father and grow up hearing rumors about his mother having been responsible even after she's already been ruled out as a suspect. So I think it's safe to say that Veronica had no involvement in this crime and was left just as perplexed as everyone else when it happened. Over the years, one theory often pushed forward was that Alistair's murder was somehow related to his job with the Bank of Scotland, particularly since he had recently given 2 weeks' notice. A thorough investigation was performed into Alistair's background, but no evidence was found to indicate that he was responsible for any financial malfeasance or involved in anything illegal. Of course, an alternate possibility is that Alistair could have stumbled upon some illegal financial activity at his job and may not have even realized it, and it wound up putting his own life in danger. As an example, we have that source named Peter who called John Beattie's radio show and pushed forward the potential involvement of an Irish businessman who had ties to loyalist paramilitary groups and did business at Alistair's bank. We also have the second mysterious source named Nate, who alleged that Alistair got himself into financial trouble and accepted a loan from some shady figures, though I'm guessing that if this was true, more evidence about something like this would have turned up during the police investigation into Alistair's background. Another rumor which has been pushed forward over the years is that Alistair's murder was somehow connected with the Livingston Football Club, which had been suffering from serious financial problems until the Bank of Scotland forced the club into administration in February of 2004. In 2019, it was reported that a whistleblower named Paul Moore, who once worked as the head of risk management at the Bank of Scotland, had been fired from the company in the weeks prior to Alistair's murder for raising the alarm on a risk loan strategy they were employing. Naturally, this led to speculation that Moore might have been the Paul referenced on the envelope, but while investigators stated that they could not rule out this possibility, Moore has confirmed that he never met Alistair, and no evidence has been found to suggest there's a connection between these two situations. Well, even if there was any truth to these rumors, and Alistair was killed over something related to his work in finance, his behavior suggested that he had zero inclination that his life might be in danger. By all accounts, in the hours prior to his death, Alistair spent what was described as an ordinary Sunday with his wife and children, and even though he found it unusual that someone suddenly decided to show up at his doorstep at 7 o'clock that night, he did not seem perturbed by it. There's also the fact that after his conversation with the man came to an end, Alistair closed the front door and went back upstairs to see his wife before going back down to check if the man was still there. I highly doubt that Alistair would have done this if he was paranoid this guy might harm him. When you look at this new theory involving the decking area, it would fit with Alistair's actions. To recap, Alistair sent a letter of complaint to the Highland Council's planning department earlier that week, and the Havelock received their own copy just 2 days before Alistair was killed. So while this was a fairly eventful situation in Alistair's life at the time, I doubt it was the type of thing where he would have expected someone to show up at his front door and shoot him for it. Now, one thing which has always surprised me about the investigation is that even though it was a fairly high-profile crime, I do not believe a composite sketch has ever been created and circulated for the unidentified man, even though Veronica came face-to-face with him and provided a description. She shared some basic details, such as his height, weight, clothing, and him being a clean-shaven white male, but I have to wonder if Veronica just didn't get a good enough look to provide enough information for a sketch. After all, it would have been dark at the time, and perhaps she didn't see his face for any longer than a few seconds. Hell, Veronica couldn't even say what kind of an accent this man had, since the only words she heard him utter were Alistair Wilson. It's been reported that she underwent regressive cognitive therapy to see if there was anything in her memories that she might have forgotten about, but this didn't turn up anything. What's interesting is that in recent years, investigators have stated that they believe 2 people were involved in the crime and that the man who showed up at the front door may not have been the same person who pulled the trigger and killed Alistair. It now seems apparent that police may have determined the identity of at least one of the perpetrators, as they believe it was a local resident who was in his early 20s at the time and a regular at the Havelock pub, and has spent time in prison for drug offenses. It's unclear if police have ever shown a photograph of the specific individual to Veronica, but if they did, I'm guessing she could not identify him as the man she saw. Given the tension which now exists between the Wilson family and Police Scotland, it's possible they never asked her to make an identification at all, but could it be possible that the man Veronica saw at the front door was not the shooter? After all, when Veronica discovered her husband's body, she said she saw a glimpse of a man walking down Crescent Road to her left, but since he was in the distance, she may not have gotten a good enough look at him to confirm if he was actually the same man she saw earlier. When she originally answered the door, Veronica was taken aback that the guy never said hi or attempted to make any conversation with her and simply said, Alistair Wilson. I'm not sure if this man was expecting Alistair himself to answer the door and was thrown off when Veronica did so instead, but he did not seem concerned about killing her, even though she saw his face. The theory pushed forward by investigators is that the shooter may have enlisted the help of an accomplice to go up to Alistair's front door on their behalf because they were a local resident and concerned about being recognized. It's interesting how in 2022, police announced that they were adjusting the age range of the suspect from between 35 to 40 years old to 20 to 40 years old, and about a year later, they revealed that this resident was in his early 20s when the murder originally took place. Veronica reported only seeing one man walking away from the scene rather than 2, but given the amount of shock and stress she would have been under at that time, it's possible she could have missed seeing a second person, or perhaps they were sitting in a parked car somewhere which the shooter climbed into before they drove away. After all, the murder weapon was later found in a nearby drain that was located at a spot where someone could have tossed the gun from the passenger side of a vehicle. While we're on the subject of the murder weapon, one detail which seems to point away from the crime being a professional hit is the fact that the shooter decided to use a very distinctive antique firearm, a semi-automatic .25 caliber Haenel Sewell Model 1 Schmeiser patent handgun, which would have been manufactured in Germany sometime between the 1920s and 1940s and were extremely rare in Scotland by the 21st century. You would think that an experienced contract killer would use something far less unique which had less chance of being traced back to them, but perhaps this was the only weapon that particular shooter had access to at the time. It might be easy for us North American listeners to forget this, but there are far more restrictions for firearm ownership in the United Kingdom, and while members of the public can own them, they must be properly licensed. This handgun and the ammunition that was used were never registered to anyone, but the person who was suspected of being involved in this crime allegedly kept guns locked in a cupboard during this time period, so perhaps they were some sort of gun collector and decided to use this antique World War II era pistol he owned to kill Alistair. It was probably bad luck for the shooter that this particular drain just happened to be blocked at the time and needed to have some gully cleaning performed on it, because otherwise, I'm not sure the gun ever would have been found. In recent years, a witness has come forward and said they recalled seeing two men pointing a handgun at the North Sea at East Beach in Nairn about 1 month prior to the murder. In America, that sort of thing might not raise an eyebrow, but pulling out a firearm in a public place is far more unusual in Scotland, which is why this witness felt there might be reason to believe those same two people were later involved in Alistair's murder. I should also make mention of the cigarette butt which was found near the crime scene, as police reported that they were able to obtain a DNA profile from it, but there's never been any follow-up. I always had my doubts that the cigarette butt belonged to the killer, as there's nothing to indicate that the man who showed up at Alistair's front door was a smoker. However, since it's now suspected that two people were involved in the crime, I guess it's not impossible that the second person could have had a cigarette down the road while Alistair and the man were conversing. However, given that this was near a pub, and the patrons there had a habit of leaving broken glass on the road and in Alistair's garden, it would not surprise me at all if the cigarette butt was just left there by a random pub-goer and has no connection to the crime. Anyway, the oddest thing with this theory about the pub's decking area being the motive for the murder is that the landlord, Andy Burnett, is not considered to be a suspect. Burnett did not get the required planning consent to build the decking area and instead submitted a retrospective planning application, but Alistair then submitted his objection to the Highland Council, and this could have conceivably led to Burnett being forced to remove the decking area at great financial cost to himself. I know that Burnett received a copy of Alistair's complaint just 2 days before the murder, and there were reportedly rumblings about the whole situation by the pub's patrons throughout the weekend. However, even though Burnett eventually relocated to Nova Scotia, he has been interviewed during these past few years, and it does not sound like investigators suspect him of being involved in the crime. In fact, before he left Nairn, he agreed to speak with Peter Blexley for his book, To Catch a Killer, and Blexley described Burnett as acting like he had nothing to hide or be fearful of. Besides, we know that Burnett had been drinking at another bar down the street on the night of the murder, and showed up at the scene when Alistair's body was being taken away by paramedics. This definitely rules out the possibility of Burnett being the shooter, and no evidence has ever been found to indicate that he hired someone to kill Alistair. So this leads us back to the individual who was reportedly a regular at the Havelock back in 2004 and is now considered to be a potential suspect by police. Even though this man's name has never been released publicly, enough details have been shared about his background, such as him serving time in prison for drug offenses, that I'm sure many residents of Nairn have figured out who he is. But that only makes it all the more surprising that he would commit a crime this brazen and manage to get away with it for 20 years. I mean, it would be one thing if the guy got drunk at the pub that night and decided to go across the street and shoot Alistair in a fit of rage, but this was clearly a calculated, premeditated murder. How could Alistair's complaints about the decking area be such an important issue to this person that they not only decided to commit murder, but managed to enlist the aid of an accomplice to help them pull it off? If the police's theory is correct, and Veronica's description was accurate, the accomplice would have been between 35 to 40 years old at the time. Veronica clearly did not recognize him, and while they may have figured out the identity of the shooter, I'm not sure if police have an idea who this second man is. Since he has never been identified, I would not be surprised if he did not live in Nairn and left town after the murder took place. After all, Nairn is a small town, and Veronica still lives there, so there would always be a risk of her running into this guy in public and recognizing him. But if he was not the actual shooter, then I have zero idea what motive he would have had to go along with something like this. Well, regardless of what the motive was, I think we can all agree that the way this crime unfolded still makes no sense whatsoever. Obviously, the biggest unanswered question is the significance of the empty blue envelope which had the name Paul written on it, and I have not heard anything to suggest that either of these two suspects went by that name. And while Veronica did acknowledge that her family knew a few people named Paul at that time, she could not think of a reason why any of them would be connected to the murder. Now, the detail about the envelope being empty is based strictly on Veronica's recollection, as she said that she noticed it was empty when Alistair carried it upstairs with him following his first conversation with the man. While I suppose it's possible that something could have been removed from the envelope before Veronica saw it, she described her husband as being bewildered by the whole situation, so I'm assuming the envelope was already empty when it was handed to him. Veronica confirmed that Alistair had a conversation with the man, but it was too muffled for her to hear anything, but I'd really be curious to know what they talked about. I don't get the impression that Alistair recognized this guy, so did he just say something like, "Here's a delivery for you," and Alistair didn't notice the envelope was empty or that the name Paul was inscribed on it until after he closed the front door? The envelope must have had some significance if the killer still had the wherewithal to retrieve it before they left, but the big unanswered question is, why didn't he just shoot Alistair when he first answered the door? Well, if the shooter was an entirely different person, and the man at the door was just a decoy to lure Alistair to his death, their actions make more sense, but how could they have known Alistair would even come back outside? Veronica said that when he first came upstairs, she suggested that they put their sons to bed for the night and then try to figure out what was going on, but Alistair said that he wanted to go back downstairs and see if the man was still there. But how would things have played out if Alistair had not done that? Would the murder have never happened? Veronica did say that after Alistair left, she thought she heard a muffled conversation before she heard the gunshots, so could Alistair have said something which prompted the shooter to kill him? I have to harken back to this quote from Peter Blexley, quote, "He went to the front door to negotiate, not assassinate. He was prepared to kill, but didn't intend to kill. Something during those exchanges altered the dynamic, and Alistair died as a result." End quote. Well, Blexley originally made this quote back in 2017 when people were more inclined to think that the motive was financial, but I'm really not sure how this quote would apply if the murder took place because of the dispute involving the decking area. Did the killers or killers try to convince Alistair to withdraw his complaint about the Havelock, and when he said no, they decided to shoot him? That's an incredibly dumb reason to commit such an elaborate murder, but people have been killed for even dumber reasons. Overall, this whole theory with the decking area still raises more questions than it answers, and I have no idea how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. The most recent lead is information that Blexley received a few months ago about a witness who supposedly saw an elderly man crying on a bench shortly after Alistair's murder who said, quote, "I cannot believe that I have raised a son who would do such a thing." Interestingly enough, in To Catch a Killer, Blexley devoted a chapter to his attempts to track down a former Nairn resident named Sean Douglas, who would have been 34 years old in 2004 and lived with his father only a few streets away from the Wilson residence. While there was no concrete reason to suspect Douglas, he was never formally interviewed during the original investigation and refused to give a sample of his DNA to the authorities. He subsequently moved to North America, and even his own family barely heard from him and had no idea where to find him. However, with the information we have right now, I'm pretty sure that Sean Douglas is not the suspect police have been referring to, and I do not believe that Douglas's family was the elderly man seen on the bench, since he was very forthcoming about speaking to Blexley for his book. If the story about the elderly man is true, then there's a good chance he is already deceased by this point, but even so, this account could ring some bells with people who might have a recollection of an elderly Nairn resident acting this way in late 2004. However, like I mentioned earlier, my biggest fear is that due to the current hostility between the Wilson family and Police Scotland, can we even be certain that investigators are looking in the right direction? Could they be way off the mark with their theory about the murder being connected to the decking area from the Havelock? Well, in my eyes, it's too much of a coincidence that an establishment located directly across the street from Alistair's residence would receive a complaint from him just 2 days before his murder, so I do have a feeling that police must have information which adds legitimacy to this theory. It might not make much sense for an individual to take another person's life over this whole situation, but since nothing about this crime makes any sense to begin with, there's no point looking for logic. There are so many heartbreaking elements to the story, but one thing which is always particularly difficult in cases like this are when a murder victim had young children when they were killed, and then many years later, you wind up seeing interviews with them as adults and realize that they've had to live with the crime being unsolved for nearly their entire life. In recent years, we've seen interviews with Andrew Wilson, who was only 4 years old when he lost his father, and said that seeing his body in their house's doorway is the only memory he has of him. This has been a terrible ordeal for the Wilson family, and they definitely deserve justice, and the only way they might wind up attaining it is if the right person comes forward. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Alistair Wilson, please contact Police Scotland. Anyway, another special thanks to listener Alison Simmonds for narrating the opening of this episode. We've been carrying on this monthly listener voiceover contest for nearly 8 years now, and if you've already entered, you are automatically eligible for our next random drawing, so you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to enter and haven't done so yet, all you have to do is send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest, naming the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. So once again, send me an email under the subject line Trail Went Cold Contest to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the course of nearly 7 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available on our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released the audio of a panel session I participated in at the Berkshire Podcast Festival back in October, titled Life in True Crime, which was moderated by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast, and featured me discussing my life in true crime podcasting alongside Charlie from Crime Lines, Lainey from True Crime Cases, and Robert Palmer from the Broken System podcast. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode for my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1979 murder of Deborah Jackson, a victim who was formerly an unidentified Jane Doe known only as Orange Socks. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Fiacra G, Adria E, Jeremiah G, Victoria S, and Sheena M. Thank you all so much for your support. And since I covered a cold case from the United Kingdom this week, I suppose now would be an appropriate time to remind everyone that The Trail Went Cold will be returning to London to appear on Podcast Row again at CrimeCon UK this year, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch on June the 7th and the 8th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code TRAIL10. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off tickets. I just want to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Thank you.